regarding how to survive during the pandemic, which I thought was incredibly well written. It was very concise, and it was, are you losing me, Cindy? Oh, it was very concise and very well written, which is why I invited him to participate today. And then I'll ask a handful of questions, and then we will turn it over to the group to ask questions. And what you can do is submit them via chat, and then I will read them out loud to Dan. So with that, I want to first, again, thanks Dan for participating today. I've known Dan for a really long time. I probably won't quote the years because it's a lot of years, and I don't like to think that I'm actually that old. But Dan really is, in my mind, kind of Seattle's most prominent angel investor. He's been chairman of the Seattle Alliance of Angels for 22 years. And frankly, the Seattle Alliance of Angels is one of the most successful and prominent angel groups in the country. When I took over the Spokane Angel Alliance, I modeled it after what Dan has created over there. And I think over Dan's 22 years, the AOA has invested in about 125 companies, or 125 million in over 220 companies, and demonstrated an internal rate of return of over 20%. So that's a very impressive track record. On his own, he's invested in over 60 startups, and is sought out both in Seattle and nationally and internationally as an expert on angel investing. Before he got into this, he was a venture capitalist. He was the founder of Fraser Technology Ventures in Seattle. And then before that, he held executive roles at both Microsoft and AT&T. So really has a fantastic background leading up to being a successful angel investor. So with that, Dan, I'm just going to turn it over to you and provide your commentary on how we can survive during this pandemic.
Thanks. I was actually going to show some slides, but you covered most of what I was going to say, which was to just talk about the Alliance of Angels on the slides. So let's jump into the question that is on everybody's mind at the moment. And that question is, what the hell's going on and what does it mean to us as startups and investors? And I think the real thing I like to start with is a reflection on the current situation. This is not normal. We've never seen a situation not since 1918 anyway, when a pandemic like this hit the country and caused this much pain, both personal and economic, that caused unemployment to suddenly skyrocket overnight. I heard the news this morning that last week we had yesterday, I think, they reported that there were 3.7 million unemployment claims, and today the number is doubled that. And so in the course of 2 weeks, we have nearly 10 million people out of work. The public equity markets don't know what to do. They're usually the best barometer we have to figure out if things are going up or coming down or going sideways. But they go like this because people are really confused. Even the best experts are confused about where this market is going and what it means. I have no idea what the impact will be on things like bond markets over any reasonable length of time, or real estate. I don't think anybody else does either. I think it's pretty clear to most that the commercial real estate market will take a long time to recover, because people, particularly given how well we've all done with Zoom and other things like this, the working from home will continue for much longer. And so need for new facilities are probably not going to be there as much. If it recovers at all, it'll be a slow, steady recovery.
Let's face it, this is not just a U.S. problem. It's a global problem.
Hey, Dan, you cut out a little bit on your microphone there.
Can people still hear me?
There you go.
I had
You're
a
back
little
on.
trouble with my microphone. And so the questions that we all need to ask is, which we can answer, is when will it end and what will the turnaround look like? Many economists have predicted it's going to be a V-shaped curve. I don't necessarily agree with that. For those that don't know, many years ago, I was trained as a biophysicist. So I do have a degree in a science that lets you look at things like how to predict phenomena like this. My opinion, which is only informed by what I can read in the press, no inside information, is that it is going to be a slower recovery than many believe, because just the nature of a pandemic like this without a vaccine means that you need about a 70% herd immunity before you can begin to stem the tide of the growth of this. And it's going to, hopefully, we're not going to get there. Hopefully, we'll get a vaccine before 70% of the people are infected. Which leads me to sort of think about startups and what they should do. And for anybody who wants a copy of it, it's on my blog site, and anybody who needs that link, we can probably put it up at the end. But I think the right thing to do first for those of us in this, besides the personal aspects of social distancing, isolation to the degree you can, wash your hands constantly, disinfect anything coming into your house, keep your counters clean, et cetera, et cetera. Besides those things, the most important thing to do right now is take a deep breath. Understand that, like almost any other crisis we've ever faced, this too will pass. The world may not be exactly the same after this one, but we can learn from other crises, economic ones in particular, to think about what'll happen when this one ends. But this one will be a little different than the previous ones because it affects everyone, not just investors and not just workers. And so I think we'll start to see a slow recovery starting in June. I don't think it'll happen instantaneously. But Tom mentioned I did put together some thoughts about advice to startups. And this came about because a number of CEOs who I've invested in were seeking advice. And so I used the experience in, to some degree, the '84 crash, but mostly the 2000 dot-com burst, and then the 2008 mortgage crisis to reflect on what startups ought to do. And there's one reflection that I think everybody would think is obvious, but apparently to a lot of people who've never seen a downturn, this is not an obvious thing. The most important thing that a startup can do is to survive. If you want an opportunity to have your company ultimately do some great things, the most important thing is you still have to be alive at the end of the crisis. And so I say it's not obvious because a lot of people built their businesses on, well, I'll shoot the moon, and if it doesn't work, I'll fold it up and do the next one. This is not the time for that kind of thinking. So the most important thing is to do everything you can to put your company in survival mode. And the number one thing to do that is the number two thing on my list: cash is king. Conserve cash. Startups don't die from, they die when they run out of cash, not because they run out of ideas or other things. They run out of cash. As long as the idea had a good product market fit, cash is what's going to make the difference between a wonderful startup and not. In that regard, I recommend that people redo their business plans, figure out how much cash they're really going to need to weather the storm, and then take actions immediately to make that happen. I emphasize immediately because a slower action burns more cash. And if your model is to conserve cash, actions taken early have much more impact than actions taken late. Now, those of us on the call that are investors have a role to play in this. We need to be getting to our companies now, or last week, or the week before, and saying, conserve cash, stop all discretionary expenditures. And I had one CEO who came back and said, well, we've canceled all travel and we're not doing the conferences we had planned to do the next 2 months. That's how we're conserving cash. And I said, no. I mean, that's forced on you. That's not you taking action. You got to figure out what actions you have to take to conserve cash. And I recommend payroll cuts as extreme as you can. One of my companies cut 12 people that they deemed were for growth but not essential for survival, and did 50% pay cuts across the board. Which gets me to my third point. In the last 10 years at least, startups have been built with the concept, I'll raise some angel money now and I'll do some a venture round and I'll keep raising money until I get cash flow positive. I tell people, forget about raising money. Having been a venture capitalist during the 2000 dot-com burst, you didn't do a lot of new investing. You did triage on your existing companies. And I've called a lot of VCs around the area that I know, and they're telling their companies the same thing. Look, we want you to do what you can with the cash you have on hand, take out bank loans, but forget about raising money for a while. And what we're going to find is a lot of really good companies that have been started and heavily funded are going to go under. The companies that are more likely to survive, in my opinion, are the ones that are much more efficient using the money they've raised. The fourth thing on my list is revenue is not likely to be as substantial as your plan indicated. And that's an important statement. Contracts you have signed, people may default on. Contracts in the hopper are not likely to get approved and funded very quickly. My guess is receivables will be drawn out. But don't count on all of the revenue that's in your plan, especially any future growth revenue. But the complement to that is my number 5 item. There are going to be opportunities. I think many people probably saw that Outdoor Research in Seattle shifted their production almost overnight to start making face masks. They had the material, they had the sewers, they had everything, and rather than lay everybody off, they just started making face masks. One of my companies, Transformative Medicine, I'm on the board, in fact, chairman of the board, and immediately when this hit, they help hospitals be more efficient with the use of doc and nurses' time. And they have workflow management software that integrates with the electronic medical records. And I immediately called them up and said, have you guys thought about doing a new workflow for COVID-19? And they said, we're already on it. And in a week, they created that product, launched it, and first at Harborview, and then they launched it with a customer, with somebody who's not a customer, Evergreen Hospital. And it's now deployed in both places and getting good reviews, and they went to general market availability on Monday. And the good thing about it, and the board approved this, is they're not charging. They've made it available to their customers for free. And I think that's a great thing, because when this is all over, people who do things like that for you are the ones who you want to do business with later. I already covered some of my next things, 6, downsize, but this is going to be a profound downsizing experiment. You got to cut everything away from the company but what you need to survive. 7 is there's going to be some non-equity sources of financing through the CARES Act and other things. None of us yet know the details or how that's going to work, but every company needs to begin to take advantage of those non-equity cash raises. And then the last one is there's going to come a point when the curve of the business stops going down and begins to bottom out and come back. Sort of the inverse and slightly delayed from the flattening the curve that everybody's been talking about for the pandemic. I think you need to stay really alert with your businesses on that, because the businesses that will do the very best will anticipate that and be ready for it, not necessarily act in advance of it, but be ready to take advantage of it when the inflection point occurs and the business begins to tick up. So that's pretty much the advice I gave to the startups in my portfolio. There's a companion piece for angel investors, but I think that's less relevant to this audience. And it sort of mirrors some of the same things anyway. So with that, Tom, I'm happy to take questions or expound on anything.
Perfect. And what Dan was referring to was the 7 points or 8 points on his survival guide, which we've posted on social media, but if anybody wants it, I can follow up as well. A very, very well-written piece. So with that, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, but I would also encourage the audience here to type in questions and I will ask them on your behalf. But my first question, Dan, is you've referred a couple of times to other crashes, the one in '84, the dot-com crash in 2000, the 2008 financial crisis. In your opinion, is this on par with those previous corrections, or worse, or not as bad?
I think ultimately it'll be worse, Tom. I sort of alluded to this. The other crashes affected a portion of the economy. It had impacts that spiraled through the rest, but the direct impact was on a smaller portion of the economy. This crash is going to impact absolutely everybody. I didn't get to hear it, but I heard Bill Gates was on TV this morning talking about both his ideas for this, but also the impact it's having on him. And he's sequestered like the rest of us are. And I think his point is that this is going to impact absolutely everybody in society. Even the knuckleheads who feel like the quarantine doesn't apply to them, who are out playing basketball or beach volleyball, it impacts them. Even teenagers who feel like nothing can impact them are going to be impacted by this. Yeah. It's going to impact every part of our society.
Yep. I tend to agree with you that this is worse than the other ones. And unfortunately, I was around to experience all of those as well. And I guess the good news is they do come back. Things do correct. Next question for you is, for those companies that, don't have 12 months of cash, can't secure new capital, and have already cut costs to the bone, are there any, pausing strategies or mothballing strategies that can enable them to reemerge when the pandemic is over?
Yeah, everybody always hates this answer, but it's the only honest one I can give. It depends. There are certain businesses where if you lose your momentum, you're lost. And then there's other businesses where you can sort of hit the pause button. I think that, a lot of restaurants are hopeful that they can hit the pause button and come back. They may be able to. A good friend of mine owns three nice high-end restaurants in Seattle, and two of them they just closed up completely and laid off their staff, and the third one they went to skeleton staff and do a limited takeout menu, but they laid off 100 people. And I asked, do you think you'll get the 100 people back at the end of this? And they said, we hope so and think so. So there are certain kinds of businesses, and it depends upon the nature of the business, where you'll find that they can hit a pause button. It's almost like our entire society is hitting the pause button.
Mhm.
And for those, there is a way. For others, there's not. The good thing I'm seeing in this is for those of us who grew up in my generation, going to work was always the key thing. Over the last 15 years, with the spread of certain technologies like Zoom, we find more and more people working remotely and working from home. And I think that's going to be a trend that does not go away after this. But the good news for companies that do have a remote working culture, people are able to work remotely and get their work done and keep doing things. The problem is the customers generally won't be buying.
Mm-hmm. Talking about the restaurants that have laid people off, or the restaurant owner that another question I have, what strategies can, that restaurant or other startups deploy to retain talent while slashing salaries and bonuses? If I'm an employee of a startup or a restaurant and you're cutting my salary by 50% and taking away my bonus, what can you do to say, hey, Tom, what can you do to keep me from going somewhere else?
Well, that is a great question. I have three different sort of points of view on that. Point of view number one is that the best leaders in our startups aren't going to get asked that question. If this is the first time they faced a leadership crisis and the first time that they talk to their employees with this kind of candor, then they have a very big problem. And they probably won't survive. And hopefully it'll be an education and leadership to them so that they know in the future, you treat your employees well from the beginning, not just when there's a crisis. Mm-hmm. On the flip side, by the way, I say the same thing to every entrepreneur I've ever dealt with. Just because somebody's invested in your company doesn't mean, and you're no longer raising money from them, doesn't mean you discard them. Communicate to your investors, and as a CEO to your employees. Make sure everybody's in the same boat. The good thing, if there is any good news about this pandemic being global and almost universal, is my question is, where are people going to go? If you have to lay them off, there aren't any jobs. There's no real place they can go. But the third thing, and this is something I say to angel investors, and Tom, I know you've seen this too, is during market downturns like this, the very best entrepreneurs are generally the first ones to start new great companies, because your world has been shaken. And you may have thought you were working for a big company that would keep you on and take care of you, and then you suddenly find yourself furloughed. And you've always wanted to do a startup, you're passionate about it, you're not waiting for them to bring you back. You're working from home and you're creating another great company. That is an opportunity for angel investors who still have some cash.
Mm-hmm. In one of your, I think it was in point number 3, you talk about forget about raising money. And you start out by saying, and your angels will continue to invest. Did you mean to imply that, during this pandemic, angels are investing, but VCs are not?
I think that history has proven to me that VCs need to continue to invest because they take management fees, and their investors won't allow them to collect management fees if they're not investing. However, what generally happens is the VCs, and I've talked to quite a few this time, but it happened last time, is they will triage their companies. So they'll look at the companies and say, how much funding do we have to keep which companies alive, and they'll jettison some and keep the others alive. I think it's going to be a while before a VC does a new deal. I've heard that some VC term sheets that were already out there have been pulled.
Mhm.
That would be new behavior, because in the last couple times that generally didn't happen. Angels, on the other hand, I think if you've treated your angel investors well, and you need a little bit more money to weather a storm, and you've taken appropriate actions, I'm seeing evidence from a few companies already that have had their angels step up and say, yeah, I'll help you out for now. And I think angels will probably come back into the market quicker than VCs will.
Yep, I tend to agree with that. And I was kind of trying to bridge your comment about really good companies often emerge during crises like this. But where do they get the capital? If someone does leave another tech company and has a great idea, it's probably likely angels that they will go to during this period to get their initial funding.
Well, that's why I say, if you have an existing company and you've already raised a bit of money, it's time to sort of hunker down and use what you have. I've been told by a number of venture capitalists who have pretty large portfolios that the first thing they did was tell their companies, go to the banks and tap every line of credit you can get. And the ones that did it early actually succeeded in getting some lines of credit from the banks. The ones that are a little later in the cycle are being told, we're not lending right now.
Yep.
So it may be too late for some of that strategy already. But I do think that angels tend to be in this not just to make the money, but also to help good startups happen.
Yep.
The point I'm making with this is that it's going to be a shifted paradigm from what was happening. In the past, you got people who came in and said, I need $5 million on a 15 pre for an idea on a piece of paper with no product, no customers, and no revenue. And they were getting it sometimes. I think the new paradigm is back to the old one. It's going to be based on fundamentals. Companies are going to have to figure out how to create these new great companies with a lot less cash. And that means opportunities for angels, not necessarily for VCs.
Yep. We're getting a number of questions here from people on the call, and I'm going to read a couple of them. One here is from Tyler Alvarado, who runs a company in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, called Continuous Composites. And Tyler's question is, Dan, your advice to startups to preserve cash and get lean with personnel and payroll costs is spot on. However, those actions have negative implications on companies eligible under the CARES Act, specifically the PPP, and having that debt forgiven. So taking immediate action can have negative implications on those sources of funding. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wrote this before we knew what the CARES Act was going to do. And of course, I would modify it based on circumstances. When I say conserve cash, I say look at every possible way to conserve cash. If you're eligible for the CARES Act, for the PPP part of the CARES Act, and you can take advantage of that by not laying off your people, please don't lay off your people. I mean, none of these solutions are one size fits all. And I guess my point is, as a board member looking at startups and mentoring certain entrepreneurs, you got to give advice appropriate to them. But the number one thing you have to understand is cash is going to be king, and conserve it any way you can. Don't do stupid things, but be very rational in your use of it. And if you do qualify for PPP under the CARES Act, then you should take advantage of it. I would have preferred government action that was immediate, not that took 4 weeks to put in place. Because you're trying to plan to save a business on action that, frankly, I think is still not certain. the CARES Act passed, the money's been allocated, but as of yesterday, when I was trying to get copies of the rules and regulations to forward on to some of my companies, there's still a lot of things up in the air that are not well understood. The one thing I did hear that makes a lot of sense to me from one of my CEOs is he called 4 different banks, and 3 of them said, "Oh, we don't have an existing relationship with you. We're not going to help you." Mm-hmm. And only the bank that he had the existing relationship with has said, "We're trying to do this." Turns out they're not an SBA lender. The CARES Act for startups, for small businesses, is all done through the SBA. And so banks are scrambling to become official SBA lenders now so that they can take advantage of this for their customers.
Okay. One interesting observation that I've always also had that Jan Carroll, who's on the call here, asked is, long-term investors in the public markets, many of them are seeing this is an attractive time to invest because valuations have come down. Why aren't we seeing that in the venture capital community? Why are they taking a different approach and saying pulling term sheets and not really out there being really active and taking advantage of more favorable entry points?
There's about 6 questions wrapped up in that one, and I like them all actually. But one is that one argument that angels will stop investing is that there may be better opportunities to make some multiple on your money more quickly in the public markets with valuations down. Yes. But the reason you find that venture capitalists will be slower to react is, I alluded to a little earlier, but let me be very explicit. The business models that have been created over the last 10 years are ones where venture capitalists, let me take a step back because you need to understand the context for this. It's an arithmetic problem. If you're a venture capitalist with a $2 billion fund and you have 20 general partners, then each general partner is responsible for investing about $100 million. Just the arithmetic of it. Mm-hmm. And if your fund is a 4-year fund, and each partner typically does about 1 deal a year, then each general partner is going to have to invest between 25 and 50 million a year in one company if you're only doing 1 deal a year. And so they're looking for companies where they can put a lot of capital and get a great return. The problem with that is the only way to get that kind of return on that kind of investment is to have a company worth $500 million or more. And that's been the model that a lot of companies are being founded on. They're coming in, people aren't interested in modest exits. They only want these grand, big exits. 2 generations ago in venture capital, people invested, $100,000 as a seed investment in a company and expected to put in $500,000 and make 10 times their money. That's gone. Because the funds are so large to get the kinds of management fees that people want, to pay salaries that people want, you can't do this. The companies are not invented on a shoestring anymore. So we have a whole generation of companies that have come along that have been told you need to take this much money and invest this much money to be interesting to us. It's going to take a while for that model to change. The venture capital funds are going to have to change. And on the other hand, angels don't have to invest anybody else's money. We don't get a salary for investing. We invest out of our own pockets. And so for us, I think the new normal is probably going to be better for us. And that's why I think angels will adapt to this and entrepreneurs will adapt to this more quickly than venture capitalists will.
This is a little bit off topic, but you're kind of implying some holes in the venture capital model. and why perhaps the angel model is not only better for investors, but also perhaps better for companies themselves.
Well, that's the last part of that last question, actually. Look, there are certain businesses that require a lot of capital to get going. Just the way it is.
Yep.
And if you have a business, you know, I used to do telecoms investing, and in telecoms investing, you sort of needed 20 million to find out if something was going to work. In drug discovery, you're probably looking at 20 million to find out if your drug is going to work. There are certain industries and certain businesses where you need that kind of capital to find out if things will work. And if that's the case, and you're an entrepreneur starting one of those businesses, you want to come out of this having made some decent money for putting 10 years of your life into a business like this. Perfectly reasonable. And so you recognize that you're going to need multiple rounds of increasing amounts of money to do that. I'll use another example out of my own portfolio. In 2003, during the somewhat of the trough of the 2000 depression, we had a company come to the Alliance of Angels looking for funding. You may have heard of it. It's called DocuSign. And their first round was in the single-digit millions. And I think, if I remember right, they were raising $500,000 to get going in their seed round, maybe a little bit more. And over the course of the next 12 years, they took in $550 million. And they filed S1s 3 times and pulled them back. And at the end of the day, I was despairing that I would ever see my capital back from this company. But good news is it came back, and they did really well. And so I'm very happy with DocuSign at the moment. But the liquidity from a 2003 investment didn't come till 2016.
Yep. But that's not an unreasonable expectation. I mean, we all would prefer to see things quicker, but I think if you're going to be a successful angel investor, you have to realize that it may take 10 or 15 years sometimes to grow a truly industry-leading business like DocuSign.
Yeah, but for angels, most of my companies, I don't count on doing an IPO.
Yeah.
And therefore, I don't think I'll have to wait 16 years to see something happen. I think for most of my companies, I expect that they're going to get acquired for something between 25 and 60 million. And if I invested under the right terms to begin with, I can make a 10x return on that. And I'm perfectly happy with that.
Yep. Well, that's a topic for another presentation. We'll get back to the survival. I've got a question here from Nick McLean, who's a CEO of a startup in Spokane called Odd Jobbers. And his question is, Dan, I'm curious how you would approach finding a balance between cash conservation and investing in long-term product development. Pausing longer-term projects could hinder a company's ability to excel once the pandemic passes, but the company must also survive well past the pandemic in order to get suitable return on that investment.
Well, I love that question. Thank you for that, because that, I think, is really the central point of what I've been trying to say. I agree with everything you said, but the last thing you said is you got to survive past the pandemic. And if you continue to do and focus on the long-term product, if it inhibits your ability to survive past the pandemic, you can't do it. You got to survive. That's why I always said survival is the number one thing. Everything else is beyond that. I'll use another story out of my venture capital portfolio back when I was a venture capitalist. The second investment in our first venture capital fund was a company out of Indianapolis, Indiana. It was a marketing automation company. I was nervous about the investment because I think it was about the 7th or 8th marketing automation company in the market. When the 2000 crash happened, almost every other one of the marketing automation companies crashed and burned. They had very high payrolls. They had very high burns. Their customers went to ground. They lost their revenue. My company was a little earlier, and being based in Indianapolis had a much lower per payroll. And wouldn't you know it, the cycle turns, it comes back around. And how many marketing automation companies are out there that could be acquired by the bigger players? Pretty much one. And they got acquired by NCR for 600 million, which made our first fund, which, you know, average return of capital for a 2000 vintage fund was 60%. And we got 105%, which put us in the top decile. I think as much luck as anything else. But the lesson I took away from it was that if you survive, good things can happen. If you die, it's impossible for good things to happen.
Yep. Really interesting question here from Wayne Williams in Spokane, who's a very well-known business leader and entrepreneur. And his question is, the CARES Act is a rare opportunity. However, it can also slow down a decision that should be made and prevent you from making the hard decisions now. You may be making tougher ones later. Cash can inadvertently cause leadership teams to say, we have more time, and create delayed action. Deal with the hard truths today. Focus on your business survival and get your gut decision telling you what to do as the leader. It is rare that your teams will agree because they have been running a different business than you will be running tomorrow.
I don't think that's a question. I think it's a great point. What would I do? Look, you probably no one on the call knows this, but I was on the board of the Angel Capital Association for 6 years, and through a random set of events, got thrown into the public policy arena and chaired their public policy group, and therefore had to deal with legislators in Washington, D.C. about setting public policy. We got the Jobs Act passed. We got 1202, the zero capital gains for qualified small business made permanent. We got the accredited investor definition maintained. But dealing with people in Washington, D.C., to say it was a challenge is an understatement. You always want to think that they're really smart because they're senators and Congress people. The thing I learned is no. I think that the problem I have with a lot of legislation like this is it's broad brush, it's well-intentioned, and then they leave the details to the bureaucracies that actually run the government, in this case, the SBA. I am far from an expert in the SBA. I don't know how the rules are going to be interpreted. I have read opinions from 5 different law firms that seem like they're 5 different bills they're describing. So I don't know how this is going to resolve itself. And so I'm reluctant to give advice that people should wait for the CARES Act and see what happens. Now, the big question is, if the CARES Act is good for 6 weeks of payroll or 8 weeks of payroll, and you do maintain it, you're right. At the end of that, what do you have? You still have a big payroll. And if you have to then fire the people, it becomes a loan, not a grant. It's based on the assumption that we have this V-shaped recovery. And I think each business has to make their own judgment of what their recovery is going to look like, and is it worth keeping the people on board?
Yep. Actually, I've unmuted. We have an individual from one of our financial institutions in Spokane on the phone, Manny. Manny, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, Tom, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So I'll go back to Dan's earlier comments. And what that comment was is that he said he's aware of a client that has a banking relationship, but he also went to 3 other banks and they turned him away for any sort of help with SBA. That is absolutely correct. In the financial industry right now, the way SBA sort of works, and I looked at who's on this call, and really the only people really that I know that have financial industry experience are Tom and I. But basically what's going on is that we and all financial institutions are so bogged down right now with our current member base and current client base that we literally just cannot service other people, especially with the SBA pieces. So what you're finding is the bigger you are as a financial institution, the easier it is to get SBA done and processed. So for instance, I used to work for a privately held bank in Colorado, around 20 billion, and we were very good at cranking those out. Now I'm here in Spokane at a local institution, right around 3 billion, and it goes a little slower. Anything under about 1.5 billion, they rarely either have a current SBA system in place, or if they do, it's very painfully slow and inefficient. The quicker, better ones are the big, large-scale banks. They have whole departments dedicated to that, and I think that's what you're finding now. So, you know, Dan, unfortunately, you're absolutely right, is hopefully places and businesses already have good financial institution relationships in place, because that's where they're going to be needing to go and lean on. Now, what does give me hope, I don't know if Tom or Dan mentioned it, but they said that a lot of other smaller institutions are trying to get online with this. And again, that will help and give some other options. But it's gonna be weeks out before people get those systems sort of up and running. It's very, very complex, and there's a lot that goes into it. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that piece, and hopefully, I guess, trying to be really blunt, if I pray for all of you that you have a good existing financial relationship in place if you're a small business right now.
Thanks, Manny. I appreciate that.
I'd like to add one more comment to that too. I agree what you said, that some of the smaller institutions that are doing this for the first time are going to have trouble getting it up. So are some of the larger ones. There's one bank that does a lot of work with startups that has never done SBA, and they're struggling to figure out how to take advantage of this program and become certified as an SBA lender and what it means. And a lot of the old SBA lenders always required personal guarantees. And so they're having to modify all of their processes to avoid, to be good fiduciaries, but to not have to deal with the personal guarantees. So I think there's still a lot unknown about how this is going to play out. To the best of my knowledge, the first loan under the CARES Act has not yet been granted.
Okay. Once this is all behind us, what, if any, changes do you see in deal structures or valuations as a result? And one specific thing I'd like to point out is I've seen, I'm sure you've seen, a high prevalence of convertible note deals for very early stage companies. And back when you and I were active venture investors in the early 2000s, you really only did that when it was a true bridge financing. But now companies have been able to get away with that, so to speak, basically get capital today for tomorrow's valuations. But do you see that changing at all, or what changes do you see once this is all settled?
Well, I think that, boy, that's like 6 questions wrapped in one too, but I love the question. Yeah, I do think it's going to change. I've always, one of the advantages of gray hair is that you get a better perspective on pendulums moving back and forth. And we went through a prolonged period where deals became very entrepreneur friendly and much less investor friendly. In an instant, it's moved all the way the other direction. I've never seen it swing that fast this quickly. I think probably, I don't know if everybody on call has heard my talk about the golden rule. Does everybody know the golden rule?
Tell it to us.
Yeah, the golden rule is he who has the gold sets the rules. And in the last 6 or 8 years, the gold has been a great idea that is a startup. Now the gold is the money that actually funds the startup. I think we are going to see a prolonged period where deal terms go back to the historical norms and averages. But I think it's not just, don't take this comment out of context. It's not entrepreneurs who've been greedy, who've taken advantage of investors. It's more a question of the business models that have been created that required the extra cash. And if you believe that in order to ship your first product, you have to then get 10 million of funding to ship your product, then that dictates to some degree the capital structure of your company and the financing structure. Yep. As the idea shifts and you get back to startups being truly startups of, I've got a great idea, I'm going to fund it out of my own pocket for a while, and then I'm going to take a little bit of money from friends and family and then angels. And ultimately, if it gets big, then go to venture capitalists. That is a different model than what we've been under for a while. I think, great organizations like Techstars were predicated on the fact that they would come in, help an entrepreneur figure out how to do a great pitch to venture capitalists, and they expected venture capitalists to step in at a high valuation and fund their companies. I think that's going to be gone for quite a while. Will it come back? It might. In general, I would say it will, because pendulums do swing. Yep. People forget, markets rebound. But I really don't believe that. I think this is going to be a reset of what is normal.
Yep, I agree. Well, I've got 2 more questions, unless anybody else has questions. My next one kind of just loops back to your very beginning comments about how there will be change as a result of this. And my question is, what paradigm changes in consumer behavior do you foresee once the pandemic is over with?
Yeah, I'll preface that by saying, if I really knew the answer to that question, I wouldn't be telling anybody.
Oh, come on, Dan.
I'd take advantage of it, but I do see a number of things happening. I mentioned one of them already. I think distance working is going to become more of a new normal than it already is. I think that one of the things that I'll find fascinating as somebody who before the pandemic was probably eating out 3 or 4 nights a week, I think it's going to be slow before people decide to come back. I think one of the things that is going to be an enduring consumer trend is the respect for first responders, which has always been since 9/11 pretty high. I think with this is going to get higher. It is my fervent hope, although not necessarily an expectation. Part of the reason the pandemic got so deep in the US and will continue to get worse before it gets better is we've done such a bad job in STEM education in this country. We have a group of leaders who not only aren't scientists, but are somewhat anti-science. And, it's nice to hear the political leadership finally talking about facts and data instead of political assumptions. And I think that's been now true across the board. Mm-hmm. When you get people like Anthony Fauci, I never would have expected Tony to become a folk icon. It's sorry that it took something like this for doctors and scientists to be as well respected again as they are. But I think that's going to be another enduring trend. And what that's going to mean is you're probably going to have, I don't know about other people on this call, but when I grew up, my hero was Jonas Salk, because I still remember when polio affected people in my community, and it was a utterly horrible disease. And having somebody come up with something that eradicated that disease, to me, was unbelievable. I mean, what a great aspiration to have in life. And I think we're going to see more of that now, instead of the superstars being, you know, a 7-foot basketball player.
Yeah.
That's my fervent hope. And if that's the case, good things can come out of this, as well as the negative. But it's going to take a long time on the consumer psyche and the national psyche to forget that 100,000 people had died.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And, you know, is it going to get worse than that? It could. There's still an opportunity, if we're really good about it, to make it better, but I don't see the national will to do that at this point.
Yep.
Hence, I'm isolating myself. But in order for this to pass and to have it be less of an epidemic in this country, we have to do that.
Yep. On the topic of working from home, one question that came up as you were responding from Garrett at a company called Quantum Star is, I'm going to paraphrase Garrett's question, but if you had two identical startups in every way, but one of those startups, everybody essentially worked from home, would that company have a higher valuation?
No. I mean, look, one of the things I hope comes out of this, not the talk, but the pandemic, is that we get back to basics. There's a certain value that companies are going to have. And we've tried to put window dressing on a lot of companies to make them look better. Better pitches, better graphics, better marketing. Some of those things matter, but at the end of the day, the fundamentals are what matter the most.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a company with good fundamentals, I don't care if their workers work from home or come into an office.
Mm-hmm.
If the leadership of that company is really strong and feels that butts and seats is the way to get it done, then that's good. I have a company whose development team all works together, but they happen to work down in Merida, Mexico, and they report to a guy in Seattle. And they've done fabulous work, but it's a very good team. And they do video conferences 3 times a week. And, you know, they meet as frequently as they would if they were sitting in the office in Seattle.
Yep. Culture plays a part in that too. How can you maintain a company culture when people are dispersed? But okay, one parting question, kind of off topic though, but with all the investments that you've made, what is your best angel investment?
There are probably 2 that come from different eras. I already mentioned DocuSign, but I'll mention another one. Probably the best single angel investment I ever made was a company called UUNet. And it was before anybody could spell the word internet. I had just joined Microsoft, and I was in my first Bill Gates review. And at this review, Bill Gates, before Microsoft, I worked at a little startup called AT&T. And Bill said, I just met with the chairman and CEO of MCI, Burt Roberts, and we decided we should do a deal. I want to use his network to turn MSN into an internet service. And not knowing any better, being brand new to the company, I did something profoundly stupid. I said, I don't think that would be a good idea. And one of the other people who I worked with said, oh, you'd want to use AT&T. And I said, no, I built that network. That would be a worse idea. And now Bill was intrigued and he said, what would you do? And I said, I'd go work with one of the pure play startups that does TCP/IP networking. And there was utter silence in the room for about 15 seconds. And Bill said, okay, and the meeting moved on. And I thought, well, he heard me, that's good. And walking out of the meeting, I was told, how are you going to do this? You just signed up for that project. And so I got to review all the pure play TCP/IP networking companies, and I picked one called UUNet. And again, being new to the company and being pretty stupid about the way they did things, I recommended an investment in the company as part of the deal. And Bill approved it, and we turned a $5 million investment into a $600 million return.
Nice.
And so that was probably my one of my two single best investments.
Huh? Well, it's good to have two. Fantastic.
Nice to have two.
Well, Dan, thank you very much. I've got a number of comments here about how helpful and useful this has been. So really appreciate you taking time out of your day to enlighten us about survival and some of the other topics that we discussed. I want to add one thing before we conclude, though. I did somewhat model the Spokane Alliance at Angels after your organization. And although our numbers aren't as robust as yours, over the last 10 years, we have as a group invested about 45 million in about 50 companies in the region here. I kind of appreciate your mentorship and guidance over the years and in doing what we can in the Spokane area to fuel startups.
Well, thank you, Tom. I've really enjoyed doing this, and it's nice to see so many people when you're stuck at home like this.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you everyone else for participating. And I envision in the new post-COVID-19 pandemic, we'll be doing more of these sort of events. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thanks. I always enjoy coming to Spokane, so it's sort of a shame I had to do it by video conference.
Well, be careful what you wish for. We might invite you to come over sometime.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody. Signing off.
Bye-bye, everybody.